They just sent me some from Spotify where I got 1 billion streams, right? That shit wasn't even $45,000.
Now, what's going on with you today? I hope you're staying blessed out there. In this video, we're going to cover 2 different topics. The first one is regarding Spotify finessing artists, ? The second topic is regarding Diddy. Didn't he? Well, he probably did, right? And I just want to hit on an important topic regarding the music industry, enablement, abuse, and some other things. If you enjoy these 2 topics in one video format, do me a favor and like the video, guys. Also, you sharing your opinion about these topics in the comment section also really helps. Plus, I really want to hear what you have to say. But starting with the first topic, which involves Snoop Dogg, an OG in a game, telling us how he got over 1 billion streams on Spotify and only received a check for $45,000.
They just sent me some from Spotify where I got 1 billion streams, right? My publisher hit me. I said, break that down. How much money is that? That shit wasn't even $45,000.
That's crazy. That is fucking crazy.
I want to talk a little bit about this clip right here from the other day where Snoop essentially said that, Spotify did a number on him, because how did I get over 1 billion streams and only received a check that was around $45K? The clip has been going viral on social media for the last day or so, and it's been starting an interesting conversation about ownership, distribution, artists getting screwed over by the major corporations, and so forth. I myself have a couple things to say about that. There's a couple things I want to talk about regarding this. First of all, I want to say this, man. I don't think Snoop is being completely truthful about this, and I'll tell you why. Because for 1 million streams on Spotify, that would average to around $4,000. Other platforms like Apple Music have a higher payout rate. So on Apple Music, for example, that would be between 5 to 7K for the same amount of streams. But Snoop Dogg was essentially calling out Spotify for this big, what's supposed to be finesse. And like I said, I don't think he's being completely transparent about everything, because those 1 billion streams should equal to over $4 million. Now let's get a little more specific though, because here's the thing. Snoop was not talking about his mechanical royalties, and that's really important here. He was, however, talking about his publishing checks, and that's also very important, but we're eventually going to get to that, so stick around and like this video if you're enjoying it, guys. Just an explanation for what mechanicals and music are. Those are essentially the streams to the sound recording, i.e. the masters. That's always traced back to the original copyright of the sound itself. So by default, when you create a record and it exists in tangible form, since you're the source of that creation, you now hold the copyright to that record. Now it doesn't stop there, because now you have to put it out, and so you use DistroKid as an example to distribute it. You put it out and the original sound receives streams, and that's what we call the mechanicals. Once the sound recording gets sold digitally, it gets streamed, or someone does a cover to it, you as the owner of this copyright are owed mechanical royalties. Now this is just one part of a song's copyright system, because the second part is the composition, also known as publishing by most people. So let's get a little bit into that as it relates to Snoop and what he said. Now Snoop said that his publisher hit him up. Most likely he's working with a publishing company who handles the publishing side for him, and he said that they told him that he only received $45K for those billion streams. When it comes to this, first of all, most artists don't own their masters, we know that, let alone their publishing. Also, most artists don't make a lot of money from their publishing, if anything, and that's only because for publishing, you actually have to get your music in the hands of someone who can help you license your records to, let's say, a publishing company, and that'll then help you get placements on movies, TV shows, video games, etc. When it comes to Snoop, we don't even know if he actually owns the lion's share of his publishing. And that's important, because if he doesn't, which that wouldn't be too uncommon, some of the biggest names in music don't, well, that means that the $45K that he supposedly received was due to the fact that he owned a very small percentage of his own publishing, which is something that he obviously didn't say in this clip, right? Also keep in mind that it's not the bigger pool of the cash that's relevant, it's how much of the pie you actually own. And if you have a bunch of people who are eating off of your publishing on top of the fact that you own a very small percentage, well, that $45K number maybe isn't so crazy, because after all, we're not talking about mechanical royalties, we're talking about publishing royalties here. People always assume because an artist is at a high level, they're automatically getting the majority of their money from their records, when that's so far from the truth. Everything depends on if the artist in question actually did their due diligence to, number one, secure the share that they're owed, And number 2, how many people do they have to pay before they get their cut of the publishing? When it comes to Spotify finessing artists, well, here's the thing. I guess this is the dark side of being an artist, because as an artist, when you put your music on these platforms, in a way, you're quote unquote giving away your music / leasing your music by making it accessible through streaming in return for a third of a penny per stream. That's correct, by the way, okay? That's the correct breakdown. Every time someone streams your record on Spotify, you get a third of the penny per stream. And that's a very bittersweet reality for a lot of artists. Why am I getting this little cut of a cut of a cut when I'm the one who created the damn song? And this is when we get into ownership, specifically ownership of music and ownership of entire systems. If you're not the one providing the infrastructure, you're always not going to get the biggest piece of the pie. That's just how things work. As an example, did you guys know that YouTube takes damn near half of the money your favorite YouTuber makes? And all this is happening on the back end. So I, as the creator, I don't even see half of the money that I should be making. Specifically, it's 45%. And that's because I wasn't the creator of the platform I'm making this money on. Specifically, when it comes to music, an artist sees and receives even less of that money because the majority of artists, number 1, don't own their masters. Even if they do, typically they own 50% if they're lucky. And also, the majority of artists don't own their publishing. If they do, it's typically 50% there as well if they're lucky. Now take this into account, okay? A big percentage of the music, okay, as far as the music getting consumed in the music world, a lot of that music is by artists who are on record labels. And that's how the corporations stay in business, because they typically own 85% of an artist's masters. That's the standard in the, the standard deal, by the way. Crazy, right? And even worse, the musician doesn't see a single penny of that until they pay back this thing called an advance, and even then they're still getting pennies. So in the end, the musician is the one left starving. Unfortunately, that's the music business for you. Now, if everything I said discourages you from either getting into the business or staying in the business, that just means that it ain't for you. This is how things are going to be. And one of the only ways you could bypass this is by reaching a level of success where you're making enough money to live on and stay independent on, and you keep things going from that level. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever think about signing. What I am, however, saying is that if you could maintain a flow of money coming in at an independent level for a long enough time, suddenly what's going to happen is you're going to be able to stack all those revenue streams on top of each other, and before you know it, you've officially broken the matrix. Most artists won't make it to the other side because you're going to have to go through hell before you reach the heaven, and that's the truth. It's not pretty, it's not comfortable. It takes a lot of work, discipline, dedication, persistence, determination, focus, drive, and most people just don't have what it takes, and they unfortunately cave by taking an advance from a record label before they get to that place by themselves. And in return, they take that money and they give up the rights to their music, which is the very thing that would have made them all the money in the end. And this is why a lot of people say that there's not a lot of money in music. The reason why there's not a lot of money in music for you is because you do not own your music. And you don't even have to own 100% of your masters, as long as you at least own 50% of your masters. And then the other 50% typically goes to, let's say, the producer that you're working with. And let's say there's that 50-50 balance. If you put out 100 records and you own 50% of those records, do you know how much money you're going to make over time, even if those, let's say, songs get 500,000 streams each? I mean, just do the math, right? And I know some people are going to be like, 500,000 streams for 100 songs, that's crazy. Well, if you think that's crazy, that means that you think that's out of your reality. So keep thinking like that and see if that actually gets you the results that you want to get. If you don't allow yourself to be at least a little delusional when you're creating music, I mean, how are you going to get to that very high level? A lot of the people we love and respect, they got to where they're at because they had a little bit of that delusion. So there's healthy delusion and then there's unhealthy delusion. Believing that you can get 500,000 streams on each of the records that you put out, that's not unhealthy. That's just, hey, I want the best for my career, and so I'm gonna aim as high as I possibly can while still being somewhat rational. So even if I fall a little bit below that, well, that's way more than I was expecting. So in the end, you're gonna win. And you know what? Let me tell you this, right? I know 10 different artists off the top of my head right now who are making well above 6 figures off of their independent catalog. Some of those are even millionaires, but they're what we call in the music industry silent money makers. These are often the artists you would think are either broke or barely getting by because they have zero hype on social media. They don't have a crazy amount of streams. I mean, 3 to 5 million a month tops, right? However, they own the majority of those 3 to 5 million streams, and they can pack a venue of 100 people very easily, and they're selling 500 pieces of merch every single month, and they're getting a couple $100,000 100,000 views on YouTube every single month, and they have brand deals on the back end, and they're doing all this from their 2-bedroom apartment somewhere away from the city where they don't have to spend an arm and a leg just to have an apartment, and they're not really whipping anything too crazy. They might even still have that Honda or Toyota, very reliable, right, that they bought years ago. So why should they blow a bag on something just to prove a point to other people that they're doing good? And most importantly of all, they're enjoying a quiet, stress-free, no toxic music industry BS life. Those are the real winners. And if you don't think that's possible for you, well, you know what they say, right? Whether you believe or you don't believe, you're right both times. Now the question is, what do you believe? So whether or not Spotify's finessing artists, well, I say this. If they are or they're not, does it really matter at the end of the day? You're gonna have to make your way as an artist some way, right? We already know that the structure of the music industry does not favor the creator, okay? It favors the people who own the music. And most times, the artist does not own their music. And so the music industry is not going to favor the artists. I say be aware of this and you're already halfway there. The other half is you got to put in the work to make sure that your future as an artist is secured, despite your circumstances. I mean, isn't that what life is about? Isn't life about figuring out what works and doesn't work and then finding a solution to it? As creators in general, we always got to find a way to make it work, despite if the structure that we're under benefits us or not. Now, moving on to the next topic, which is Diddy being Diddy. I want to talk a little about this story really quickly that went viral the other day. Puff had some more allegations against him, and this is a pretty crazy one. And I wanted to use this story to talk about some important things. But first, let's go over this, right? So this is yet another story that comes after the multiple allegations that have came out against Diddy ever since Cassie came forward. This one, however, involves a then 17-year-old girl who alleges that she was gang baped in 2003 by Puff and some other dudes. So I want to check out this document right here and just read it, okay? If you're a little sensitive, then obviously, maybe just skip this part right here. And I understand because, there's people who've actually been in situations like this, by the way. Or should I say, people who've been the victims of situations like this. So if that's you, then just skip to the next part. I'll put a timestamp on the screen. But for the rest of y'all, let's go through this document. Here it is. So this is the document, and by the way, this part I'm just going to keep it very organic, so I'm not going to do too many cuts on my voice, just because I want to read this out and I want to give you the raw emotion of what I'm reading, because this is some serious stuff, right? But at the top it says factual allegations, so let's go through this. This is what it says, right? In 2003, Mrs. Doe was a 17-year-old 11th grader residing in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. At the time, Mr. Combs, which is Diddy, was 34 years old, twice the age of Mrs. Doe, and one of the most well-known and influential music artists of all time. A decade earlier, Mr. Combs founded Bad Boy and installed his longtime friend, Mr. Pierre, into the role of president. So Pierre is someone who's involved in this, gang bape of this young woman. So just wanted to add that in. At the time, Mr. Combs had many connections to Michigan, including among others to Black BMF, a drug trafficking and money laundering organization that is rumored to have seeded Bad Boy. Accordingly, upon information and belief, Mr. Combs' associates, including Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, spent significant time in and around Detroit, Michigan. It then continues and says, on one evening between the spring and fall of 2003, Mrs. Doe was out with friends. It was not uncommon for her and her friends to frequent bars and lounges in the Detroit area. Certain of Mrs. Doe's friends were well connected with people in the music industry. Let's see, right here it says, on the evening in question, Mrs. Doe was with friends in a lounge when she was approached by who she later learned was Mr. Pierre. Mr. Pierre was with his own friends, including the third assailant. Mr. Pierre, the third assailant, and their friends were dressed in suits. Mr. Pierre, but it continues and says, Mr. Pierre repeatedly complimented Mrs. Doe, this is the 17-year-old obviously, Mrs. Doe's appearance, saying that she was hot, among other things. He then began talking about his self-described best friend and brother, Mr. Combs. Specifically, Mr. Pierre continually stated that Mr. Combs would love to meet Mrs. Doe. So apparently they're saying that Diddy would like to meet this 17-year-old, right? Mr. Pierre even called Mr. Combs and put Mrs. Doe on a line. Mr. Combs told Mrs. Doe that he would love to meet her and that she should accompany Mr. Pierre to New York in a private jet. Shortly after, Mr. Pierre directed Mrs. Doe to go with him into the bathroom at the lounge, Once inside the bathroom, Mr. Pierre began to smoke crack cocaine from what appeared to be an aluminum can. After he finished smoking crack, Mr. Pierre suddenly took out his penis, demanding that Mrs. Doe suck his dick, and forced Mrs. Doe's head down and perform oral sex on him. After sexually assaulting Mrs. Doe, Mr. Pierre directed her to accompany him, the third assailant, and a third member of their group to an airport in Pontiac, Michigan, where a Signature, a fixed-base operator, had prepared a private jet to take the four of them to New York City. He then continues and says, upon information and belief, the private jet landed at Teterboro Airport. Upon departing the jet, 2 black SUVs were awaiting the group. Might be Diddy, right? Let's continue. Mrs. Doe got into an SUV with Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, and the other member of the group went into the second SUV. The SUV, so they were going to Diddy's house in this SUV apparently, right? Diddy spot or whatever. The SUVs brought the group to Daddy's house. By the way, Daddy's house is Diddy. That's what they say in this document, so I'm just gonna say Diddy though. The SUVs brought the group to Diddy's house, a recording studio and hangout owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. When Mrs. Doe arrived, she was escorted into the building where she distinctly remembers seeing a sign from the company. Upon entering the studio, Miss Doe's first encounter with Mr. Combs. At the time she arrived, a female recording artist was using the studio as Mr. Combs and her parents watched, and she finished up shortly after Mrs. Doe arrived and left. While still in the studio section of Diddy's house, Mr. Combs asked Mrs. Doe to sit on his lap to take a picture. And by the way, they literally have in this document, they have a photo of this. So the girl, she's literally, I'm gonna put a photo, right? She's literally sitting on Diddy's lap. So there's literally photo evidence of her being at the studio is what I'm saying. This is not like just something they put in the document and we can't really prove it, right? So literally she's sitting on Diddy's lap and there's a pic. And the document continues and says, Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant began to ply Mrs. Doe, a 17-year-old child at the time, with copious amounts of drugs and alcohol. This is what Cassie was saying, by the way. She said Diddy did the same thing, right? They essentially gave her, Diddy allegedly, right? He gave her a bunch of drugs to make her, just make her not so there in the head so he could do what he wanted to do. They say the same thing right here in this document. So the document continues and says, while the evening became a blur, Mrs. Doe does recall Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant hitting on her incessantly, stroking her body, asking to see her ass, and telling her how hot and sexy she was. Various other pictures were taken in the studio that night, leaving no doubt that Mrs. Doe was in Mr. Combs' New York City studio with Mr. Combs on the night she was baped. And again, this is literally, there's like pictures of this. So like she's in the studio in front of the microphone even, and then there's like a sign right there that says P D, Puff Daddy, right? And there's photo evidence of her being there, which usually in these kinds of cases there is not there, and that's why a lot of people usually doubt the people who come out with these kinds of allegations. They say, is there proof that she was even there? Well, now there's proof that she was literally there in the studio. Bunch of photos taken, and she must have been 17 at the time. So there can be no hesitation about that, because this was in 2003, and if she lied about her age, then they could literally just look like when were the photos taken and find out that, hey, this was not taken 2003. So she's not lying about her age and she's not lying about being in that studio is what I'm saying. Continues and says, as the night wore on, the 17-year-old Mrs. Doe became more and more inebriated, eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to having sex with anyone, much less someone twice her age. So Diddy was, he was like twice her age at that point, right? The document continues, nevertheless, that evening, Mr. Combs directed Mrs. Doe to accompany him to the bathroom at the studio. Once there, Mr. Combs removed Mrs. Doe's skirt and underwear and penetrated her from behind with his penis while she hung over the sink. It continues and says, Mrs. Doe did not consent to having sex with Mr. Combs, but he continued thrusting. At some point, Mr. Combs turned Miss Doe's around her face around to him. Essentially, he told her that he could not orgasm and asked her to squeeze his wait a second. He told her that he could not orgasm and asked her to squeeze his nipples. God damn, you's a fucking freak, Diddy. As hard as she could to help him get off. Literally sounds like Diddy, right? He then turned her back around and continued. That's not funny, but like just Diddy is a weirdo is what I'm saying. He then turned her back around and continued to rape her. By this point, Miss Doe was coming in and out of consciousness, because of the drugs and alcohol she had been given by defendants. Her next memory was looking up in the mirror above the sink to find out the third assailant had replaced Mr. Combs and was vaping her from behind. Mr. Combs was watching the third assailant sexually assault Ms. Doe from a chair outside the bathroom. So they're saying that he was watching. Sounds like Diddy again. This is everything Cassie was saying, that Diddy really liked watching her do things with other guys. So this sounds on point with his character that everybody in the industry has vouched for, or not vouched for, but you get what I'm saying. People have witnessed him being in situations like this. But anyway, it continues and says, at this point, Ms. Doe mustered the energy to tell the third assailant to stop and that she did not want to be having sex with him. The third assailant did not stop and continued to bape Ms. Doe and did not have the strength to force him off of her. I mean, a grown man, of course, she's not going to have the strength, so understandable. But they say after the third assailant was finished, he was replaced by Mr. Pierre, who began having non-consensual vaginal sex with Ms. Doe before violently forcing her to give him oral sex. During the latter part of the sexual assault, Mr. Pierre forced his penis into Ms. Doe's mouth without her consent. Ms. Doe remembers that Mr. Pierre was sweaty and that she had difficulty breathing. It's so detailed, man. Crazy. Damn. When Mr. Pierre finished, he left Ms. Doe in the bathroom alone. Ms. Doe fell into a fetal position and lay on the floor. She was lying on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. They said her JJ was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Ms. Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up, following the gang bape, and had to be helped to walk outside the building and back into the car. She was taken back to an airport and flown back to Michigan. However, she has a very limited recollection of her transport home and only remembers being in her car sometime early in the morning. Her underwear was missing. As a result of being baped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant, Ms. Doe suffers significant emotional distress and feels of shame that have plagued her life and personal relationships for 20 years. Ms. Doe knew that speaking out against the defendant would be extremely difficult, and that she would likely be subjected to retaliation and defamatory slurs and attacks. However, in November 2023, Ms. Doe read about a lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs by Cassandra Ventura, aka Cassie. Ms. Ventura's suit described a decade of physical and sexual and mental abuse. Most triggering for Ms. Doe was reading about Ms. Ventura's allegations of sex trafficking and being forced to have sex with other men against her will. Ms. Doe obviously understands that she had to been sex trafficked and that Mr. Combs' behavior in forcing women into non-consensual sex was not an isolated incident or unique only to Mrs. Ventura. Then just days later, Ms. Doe read about a case filed against Mr. Pierre, and Mr. Pierre is the other guy that was involved in this, right? So the suit alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and sexually assault his former assistant. Seeing two other women bravely speak out against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre, respectively, gave Ms. Doe the confidence to tell her story as well. As such, she files this lawsuit, and that's where it ends. So there's more in this document, but I just kind of want to stop it there and continue from here. You know, I want people to realize that the music industry is actually filled with guys like Diddy. I mean, think about it like this. How can someone who's this famous and recognized allegedly have done all these things, yet go completely untouched for this entire time? Well, the obvious answer to that is money and power and a whole lot of enabling. People in the music industry have known what kind of man Diddy has been for decades on top of decades. It's just now that the pain and suffering he's allegedly caused onto his victims is now being revealed. And that's all thanks to Cassie, who was strong enough to do what she did. And also, I know that everyone who's working around him, right, they not only knew what he was on, they were enabling the behavior, and most of them were covering up for him because he was the one providing the bread and infrastructure. And you know what the thing is? I don't think most of those people were actually bad human beings. I think they got there thinking they could be in the knowing of something as evil as this and not have it backfire. On one hand, I say, how did this man make it so far being the person he is? And another part of me is like, I understand, because once you enable a person like Diddy to be who he is, that now puts you in a place where even if you speak out, you're going to be closely scrutinized, just like him, because you let it slide. And this is the leverage Diddy presumably had over all these people. Although some of them knew exactly who he was, I'm sure a lot of them probably didn't know the extent of his sickness, because he probably had a handful of people who covered up for him. And by the way, this is not a hip-hop thing. Even though we do have a higher concentration of stories of this kind in rap, I think this is a money and power in the hands of an egomaniac and narcissist issue. Someone who's used to getting their way, especially with women, now has the influence, affluence, and validation to double down on this shitty human being that they are, even if it means hurting other people. That's a very dangerous combination. And speaking on hip-hop and rappers specifically for a second, there's a lot of those personality types in the genre that internally thrive off of that power and, you know, that control as it relates to, in this case, women. It also doesn't help that the music has a lot of those elements sprinkled all over it, whether it's the themes of violence, misogyny, controlling the hoes like some puppets or whatever, right? I believe all that negative and spiritually dark content unfortunately facilitates certain artists to feel like they, you know, can be this horrible person, and it's being accepted in the world of hip-hop because the music has elements of that, right? You know what they say though, everything that's performed in the dark will eventually come to light. And even though the culture enables a lot of that behavior that Diddy has been quietly exhibiting for the last 30 years, I think as time goes on, we're gonna see more major exposés like this, 100%. And that's gonna allow for the culture to get rid of all those people who are literally traumatizing others, specifically women, on a back end. Anyway, any thoughts on the two topics that I covered? Curious what you guys have to say. And, you know, like I said, don't forget to show this video some love by liking it, guys. It really helps promote the video in the algorithm, so I would really appreciate that. Also, drop a comment on what you think. I'm curious. With that being said, you have a blessed day, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm out. Peace.